Namaskaram, Vanakkam, Namaste. With all the connotations that go with all three. So, I'm thankful to Shastra University and Mr. Vaidya Subramaniam for giving us an opportunity to discuss such an important topic. Hopefully, and I'd say thankfully, not on a television debate. Because that would have been the worst possible forum to have these sensitive conversations, to unpack all the layers in between. So, 15 minutes is the time that's allotted. I'll take a maximum of 20 minutes.
I'll start reminding you for the bill.
Yes. So, it's very surprising, and I must thank Mr. Qureshi and Mr. Tiwari as well as Mr. Povaya for all their erudite points. And I completely understand Mr. Povaya's sentiment, because that's one of the reasons I always go in the end, so that I have the benefit of all the points that have already been made. This is perhaps one of those interesting discussions where we have had panelists question the need for and the relevance of secularism. It's fantastic. That rarely ever happens in an Indian political discussion or a legal discussion. So secularism is dispensable like a rag the moment the question of Uniform Civil Code comes into existence. How mighty convenient. It's unbelievable. I'm surprised that we even managed to swallow that statement. Fantastic. Anyways. Second, the diversity of the Hindu way of life and Hindu customs are now being celebrated, because we are being told, well, if you bring the Uniform Civil Code, it's not just I who's going to be affected, all of you will be affected. Suddenly there's a concern for Hindu rights and customs. Unbelievable again. So the strength or the importance of the Uniform Civil Code is not what it does, but it is actually going to bring out the innate, inherent hypocrisy in Indian political and legal discourse and constitutional discourse. That's exactly why I think this conversation must start. So in 2010-11, I was a very strong votary of the Uniform Civil Code. In fact, I used to write under the pseudonym Politically Incorrect for the previous avatar of Swarajya magazine called Center Right India. Because I was forced to adopt that pseudonym because I wasn't sure of the repercussions my views would get within my own fraternity, which is supposed to be the purveyor and celebrator of free speech. Because even within the legal fraternity, keep left is the typical option. So writing for Center Right India wouldn't exactly get me a lot of plaudits and applause, right? So I had to be very careful about it. But then I came out openly, I think in 2012, I started writing openly under my own name. See, here's the thing. Assume for a moment that the government had come out with a draft and then asked for opinions. They would have been told, you came out with a draft behind closed doors? You didn't even consult the community? And if you initiate a conversation without a draft, well, where is the draft? What are we exactly talking about? Why are we shooting arrows in the dark? So this is catch-22. Heads I win, tails you lose. If there is a draft, you'll be accused of imposition, fascism, dictatorialism, and authoritarianism, and all sorts of isms under the sun. But if there is no draft, well, this is dog whistle politics, because you don't have a document on the basis of which we can actually carry out an intelligent discussion. That is the argument being presented. Now, I leave it to the audience and your reasonableness and your own intelligence to draw your own conclusions as to what is the nature of the debate that's going on here. Because you cannot win in this debate, because one person or one particular community has effectively told itself, I am the perpetual victim under all circumstances. It has already told itself that. It's convinced itself of this. No, I am not naming any community here. Let's call it a group or a mindset. Okay? Now let's go to the next level. I have a certain disagreement with Mr. Povaya's position, despite my broader agreement with his overall point. And I have a specific agreement with Mr. Qureshi, despite my broader disagreement with his overall point. I don't believe personal laws are secular. Marriages are not secular. They are sacraments, at least as far as we are concerned. Muslim law calls it a contract. Catholics treat it as a sacrament. So there is a necessary nexus, even with respect to inter-se relationships between individuals with faith. So I don't wish to start with the argument under the assumption that personal laws have nothing to do with faith. I don't think that needs to be made as an argument at all in the first place to win this debate. The question is slightly different. Granted that personal laws have a basis in faith. Let's take that as the starting point of the argument. Does it mean that the state does not have the right of reform is the question. That is, even if a particular relationship is of a religious character or it has a certain religious recognition under the faith system, so to speak, and there are religious prescriptions, so to speak, does it mean that the state does not have the right to reform? That is the simple question. Because after all, from questions of untouchability to whatnot, we have always been told that although it may be a Shastric position or although it may be a religious position, the state does have the right to reform if it believes that a particular practice affects the dignity of a group or an individual. Hasn't that been the position all these years? Yes. So the fact that a particular practice is rooted in somebody's faith cannot come in the way of having a conversation with respect to dignity. Let's get that straight. Right? The question is, if the state has the power to do so, when can it do so? What kind of participation and stakeholdership is called for on the part of the state to take the community into confidence before it initiates the ball, it initiates the conversation, or before it sets the ball rolling? That is the question, right? Now here, let me give you 3 separate tracks, and I'll try to close these tracks within 15 minutes max, 10 minutes max. The track of the Hindu Code Bill, the track of the Uniform Civil Code, and the track of the Shariat Act of 1937. The history of this is critical. This is very, very crucial. And I hope Mr. Tiwari revisits his position after I quote Dr. Ambedkar chapter and verse from the debates of 23rd of November 1948 on exactly what he said with respect to the erstwhile Article 35, then Article 39, which became Article 44 on Uniform Civil Code. 1. British intervention with Hindu laws started in 1776 under what were known as the Gentoo laws, because we were also called Gentoos. Hindus were Gentoos. Okay? And Hindus, because it was H-I-N-D-O-O-S, not D-U-S. We were Hindus with the crisp London accent. Right? So that interference started, and it went on until the 1940s when Dr. Ambedkar and what was known as the Rao Committee put together the suggestions for codification of Hindu law in 1941. They went around the country touring for opinions from community leaders to normal people, to lay people, so on and so forth, and there was resounding opposition to the codification of Hindu law because it changes the concept of achara or custom, which is essential to Hindu philosophy and Hindu way of life. To the extent that if achara is against a particular text or a smriti, achara will prevail because achara is reflective of an existing condition, whereas a smriti is a mere record. That is the position that has been given to achara specifically. That's one of the reasons under Article 13 of the Indian Constitution, we recognize that customs also have the force of law, not just in the field of contract, but also in the field of religion. Now, despite this massive resistance, which was recorded, the committee said, if you do this, there's going to be a disaster. You know who are the people who opposed the Hindu code? I would say, Dr. Rajendra Prasad specifically writes to Nehru over and over again, don't take it up. But Dr. Ambedkar was pushing for it because he said the codification of Hindu laws is akin to slum clearance. He said this twice. He said this dirt needs to be cleared up. This was the language used by Dr. Ambedkar. But the good part about Dr. Ambedkar is he's equally critical of everybody. And we are selective in our reliance on him depending on what is the subject under question. So I don't think we should be selective. So let me open up the Pandora's box here, which is what I typically do. So specifically, Vallabhbhai Patel was against this, to the extent that as someone who was managing the floor of the parliament, each time the Hindu bill was presented in the parliament, he would say, we don't have time to discuss, move it along, because he didn't want it to be passed. Dr. Ambedkar faced massive resistance in the parliament from across the board. And ultimately Nehru realized there is no way I can push this lock, stock and barrel in one go. So let me actually break this up into 4 installments so that the community has time to digest this. And so from 1955 onwards, After the resignation of Dr. Ambedkar in 1951, who left his office broken and completely, let's say, disillusioned, this project started, and until 1961, each of these laws were pushed gradually, despite the public having extended or rather specifically expressed its vocal resistance to it. Because you see, that was a brute majority government. The language of majoritarianism that is now being used is somehow never used in the context of the Hindu Code Bill when it was pushed against the community's interest. You see, that's how it works. It is not the issue that changes. The question is who is the subject of the issue, then conveniently everything changes. The logic will change. So this was the position. Now the good part about Dr. Ambedkar is, he was also of the very clear view that while we are discussing this issue of Hindu reform, we must equally speak of a uniform civil code. I don't see a point in leaving any particular community out of the scope of this particular discussion. No exceptionalism. That was his language. Now, unfortunately, Sri Nehru didn't want it. He said, no, they are not ready. They have not been ready since 1937, in fact. We are in 2023. Now, here's the sensitive aspect of the issue where I'll bring in the aspect of codification of the Muslim laws through the Shariat Act of 1937. The better part of this country, or the better part of this country's Muslims at that period, saw themselves as converts from the Hindu fold. Therefore, their personal laws prior to 1937 were still Hindu. So, the Muslims of North Malabar would follow Marmakatayam, which is the maternal lineage, the matrilineal form of succession. NWFP was 91% Muslim and it still followed Hindu law. How is this relevant? Dr. Ambedkar is telling this to the Muslim counterparts present in the Constituent Assembly. You have been following Hindu law all along. Since when did you have the concept of the Shariat? So Indian courts, rather British Indian courts, whenever they had to rule on Muslim law, they would go on the basis of Muslim custom and not Shariat until 1930. And Muslim custom then would be Hindu custom, because most of them were from this fold. The founder of Pakistan, the creator of a state based on Muslim exceptionalism, decides, Barrister Muhammad Ali Jinnah, that, sorry, now we will live by the Shariat. It's time to sever our ties with anything that is Hindu. And so he pushes and pushes and pushes in cahoots with the British. And then you have the Shariat Act of 1937, which finally severs the relationship of Indian Muslims from the culture of their ancestors and makes the Sharia applicable from 1937 onwards to Indian Muslims. And that is the path to Pakistan. Creation of a separate set of cultural values was among the first milestones which led to the creation of our problematic northwestern neighbor. This is the point that needs to be understood. So it's not a question of if I marry this way, you marry that way, what is the problem? It's the question of whether you live in a state or you live within a state in a state. And that is the problem that was sought to be addressed. So I'm happy to buy the argument that this is religious, but I'm equally happy to buy the argument that the state has the right to step into the picture for the purposes of national integration and unity. However, let me go a step further. So from then on, the Shariat Act becomes applicable and courts would apply only the Sharia as the touchstone for testing the validity of any custom of Muslims, of Indian Muslims. So assuming for a moment that there was ever a concept of Indian Islam, the bringing into force of the Shariat Act of 1937 effectively killed that particular entity thanks to the Shariatization of the cultural, social and personal lives of Indian Muslims. Now, those who defend the continued existence of the Shariat Act of 1937 find themselves in the august company of Barrister Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And those who are saying interference with this particular act at this particular point of time would amount to interference with the core, let's say the corest of our beliefs, will find themselves in the same company. So if anything, the ones who are batting for the repealment of the Shariat Act of 1937 are batting for the revival of that entity called Indian Islam. Because we are basically saying, you lived by these customs for centuries until 1937. But the creation of the Shariat Act has effectively cleaved the society significantly. So who is batting for plurality, who is battling for Indianization, and who is batting for national unity? I'll leave it to the audience to ask themselves this question. Final point. It's one thing to say that the community should be consulted. But please note that the state has the right to prevail over and above the community's opinion if it believes that this is the right way to go. Otherwise, the constant stick with which the Hindu community is hit is if the state had not interfered, untouchability would have continued. Well, the fact of the matter is we abolished untouchability on our own even prior to Article 17 coming into force thanks to the Temple Entry movement. Unfortunately, that movement doesn't seem to be happening in any other group or mindset. Therefore, since truly reformist voices are by definition textbook minorities in this country within that particular mindset, the state as the parents patriae has an overwhelming duty, and I said the obligation and the right to step into the territory and set the house in order. Thank you.
I can quote it for you.
As the youngest member on the panel, allow me to take just this indulgence. Just this submission, please. And this is from Dr. Ambedkar, because I think Dr. Ambedkar has become a convenient political tool as opposed to understanding him in totality. This is from page number 550 of the Constituent Assembly Debates and 23rd of November 1948, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. I am afraid I cannot accept the amendments which have been moved to this article, which is Article 35, 39 and hence Article 44. In dealing with this matter, I do not propose to touch on the merits of the question as to whether this country should have a civil code or it should not. That is a matter which I think has been dealt with sufficiently for the occasion by my friend Sri Munshi and Sri Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer. Mr. Hussain Imam, in rising to support the amendments, what was the amendment? The amendment was, let it not be part of those parts of the Constitution which are enforceable. Let it be moved to the directive principles of state policy so that it is not enforceable. That was the amendment that was moved by Muslim members saying, let it be part of the directive principles of state policy so that there is a hands-free approach as far as the issue of personal laws is concerned. So with respect to that amendment, Dr. Ambedkar is basically saying, Mr. Hussain Imam, in rising to support the amendments, asked whether it is possible and desirable to have a uniform code of laws for a country so vast as this. If you find any resonance to the arguments being made now, I wouldn't be surprised. Now I must confess that I was very much surprised at the statement for the simple reason that we have in this country a uniform code of laws covering almost every aspect of human relationship. We have a uniform and complete criminal code operating throughout the country, which is contained in the Penal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code. We have the law of transfer of property, which deals with property relations, which is operative throughout the country. Then there are the Negotiable Instruments Act. And I can cite innumerable enactments which should prove that this country practically has a uniform civil code in its content and applicable to the whole country. The only province the civil law has not been able to invade so far is marriage and succession. It is this little corner which we have not been able to invade so far, and it is the intention of those who desire to have Article 35 as part of the Constitution to bring about that change. It is therefore too late now to ask the question whether we could do it. As I've already said, in North Malabar, the Marmakatayam law applied to all, not only to Hindus, but also to Muslims. It is to be remembered that the Marmakatayam law is a matriarchal form of law and not a patriarchal form of law. The Muslims, therefore, in North Malabar were up to now following the Marmakatayam law. It is therefore no use making a categorical statement that the Muslim law has been an immutable law which has been followed since ancient times. That law as such was not applicable in certain parts, and that it has been made applicable only 10 years ago. So he is making the argument that the application of Shariat in totality to Indian Muslims was barely a decade old when this conversation was going on. So what are you talking about? There is a lot more to be said. This entire portion, he speaks of why the Shariat Act and its introduction led to the creation of a two-society nation. Thank you.